I'm Carol Valente. I'm a Senior Policy Associate at Energy Consumers Australia. It is my absolute pleasure to welcome you all to this second webinar of the series we're hosting on the 21st Century Energy System Planning. We definitely did something great in the first webinar because we've got over 120 people joining the session today to learn more about demand-side solutions and integrating consumer resources into energy system planning. And by the way, if you couldn't join the first webinar, we'll have it recorded. And as soon as I stop talking, I'll share the link in the chat as well. So as I also mentioned in the first webinar, energy system planning is fundamental in building consumer trust and in bringing consumers along the net zero journey and in delivering that least cost, least risk transition that benefits all Australians. And with the help of the experts that we have today, we want to bring new perspectives about what energy system planning can be and achieve. Before we go any further in the discussion, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet, live, and work today. And I also pay my deepest respects to all elders, past, present, and emerging of the distinct lands on which you are all on today. I've been living in the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation for 6 years now. I chose to call these lands my home since 2017, but I acknowledge that these always were and always will be Aboriginal lands. And it is their spiritual connection to land, their respect for all elements of the nature, their strong sense of place and belonging, and their rich culture that makes this a beautiful place to live and enjoy life. And we all know tomorrow will be a very important day and decisive opportunity to demonstrate our respect and our empathy to rightfully recognize the First Peoples of Australia in the Constitution and give them the voice to provide guidance and advice on issues that matter most to them. So yeah, we're all in support. Okay, so what do we have planned for today? Well, we've been advocating for a while now that improving energy performance of our homes and businesses should be recognized as a high priority resource in energy system planning. If you haven't seen our submission to the National Energy Performance Strategy, I'll also send that later with more information in the email. And we know that the way consumers use, generate, and store energy has important implications for the system as a whole. And our capacity to achieve this least cost, least risk energy future depends on what people do in their everyday, day-to-day home and work. So Brian Spak, Director of ECA's Energy System Transition Team, will provide you with a quick overview, scene setting of what does proactive demand-side planning looks like. How do we incorporate consumer energy resources into planning? And then we'll have a keynote presentation from Josh Keeling from UtilityAPI on the history of demand-side planning in the US, some useful tools and approaches to demand-side integration to system planning, and potential applications to the ISP, the Integrated System Plan, and how it can be considered in the review process as well. After that, Brian will then convene and facilitate a panel discussion between the keynote speaker and the representatives from DCCEEW and AEMO. And lastly, we'll have time to take questions from the audience. We have a lot of time today, actually, and I encourage you to submit all your questions during the keynote presentations and the panel discussions via the Q&A feature in Zoom. So that should be in the bottom of your screen with the 2 speech bubbles. And you can also upvote those questions as well. And my colleague Bella and I will be moderating these questions and feeding these to Brian and the panelists. So, all right, you've heard enough from me, so over to you, Brian.
Thanks. Thank you very much, Carol, and thanks everyone for joining us. It's my pleasure to join you today from Awabakal lands, yeah. So let's get into it. I don't want to spend too much time sort of providing an overview, but I do think that you know, I think everybody that's participating is already aware of the fact that Australia leads the world in rooftop solar adoption. I like to look at this chart from APVI because it helps reinforce really just how strong rooftop solar is in certain parts of Australia, and the fact that, you know, Australian consumers are already very active participants in the energy system, arguably the most active participants in the energy system anywhere in the world. And so we have this clear global leadership in consumer participation, at least in one aspect, in rooftop solar in our energy system. And we know that consumer resources can often be least cost ways of providing energy in the needs of in energy needs. And so really today that's kind of what we want to talk about, is how do we unlock those benefits. But not all is perfect in consumer land and in Australia. And so if you move to the next slide, you see that this is the International Energy Efficiency Scorecard. They only scored 25 countries. This is done by the American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy. They do this every few years. So Australia, unfortunately, ranks 18 of the 25 countries ranked, right behind Indonesia, and sort of in the same company or right ahead of Brazil. Sorry, Carol. Thailand, Egypt, Russia, Saudi Arabia, South Africa, and the United Arab Emirates. So not great company, really. And there's absolutely a lot of opportunity for us to move, to take advantage of consumers' clear interest and to participate in the energy system and to become more and to become more efficient. So, but how do we do that? So if we go to the next slide, I'm going to give a bit of a quote from Amory Lovins, who said, you know, people don't want raw kilowatt hours or lumps of coal or barrels of sticky black goo. They want hot water or hot showers, cold beer, comfort, mobility, illumination. It's like when you go to the hardware store looking for a drill, what you really want is a hole, not a drill. And why is it that you want the hole? Asking those questions is the first step in good design. So I think I think the ability for us to think more clearly and more squarely on why we want energy and the energy services that it provides can help us unlock other opportunities and other ways of serving consumers' energy needs. I've included, I love the hot showers and cold beers idea, and we'll say it often, and I sometimes get chided for that being somehow sexist, and so people will often say, what about not cold beers but cold rosé? I put cold semillon because I'm in the Hunter region. But anyway, if we go to the next slide, you know, so when we think about energy, the energy system and energy planning, right, we really focus primarily on electricity and gas, a little bit on petrol and diesel, maybe, or these are sources of energy. Some Australians still use a small portion, but some Australians still do use wood to heat their homes. Of course, there's other forms of energy, jet fuel and what have you, biofuels that are part of the energy mix and that could be listed here. But I think it's dangerous for us to think just about energy or these fuels. What we really need to think about, and if you move forward to the next slide, are energy services, right? So it's just all of these things I was talking about. There's a long list of them. And once you start to think about hot water or hot showers as a service, that enables you to think about various ways to meet that need that don't necessarily rely upon raw kilowatt hours or barrels of sticky black goo, right? They unlock efficiency in smart energy use, which is the term I often use to describe demand response, as ways to meet consumer needs, ways to provide energy and capacity at a lower cost that don't require long timelines to build. So how do we do that? And how do we allow those resources to compete against sort of traditional ways of providing energy? So if we go to the next slide, the the national energy rules, I would encourage everyone, right? This whole webinar, I should have mentioned this at the beginning, right, is part of the Commonwealth's integrated system plan review. And so part of that review is looking at whether or not the rules around the integrated system plan should be tweaked a bit or a lot. And so I'd encourage everyone to read those rules. The beginning of those rules talks about the purpose of the ISP, which I've written up here. It's about, the efficient development of the power system that achieves power system needs. So power system and power system needs are defined in the rules. But those, they're rules, they can change. So let's think, I guess I want us to think a little bit about what is the power system and where does it begin and end? Because the way that we draw that boundary enables us to think about what can and cannot be included in things like the ISP, and not just as assumptions or as a parameter to meet, like a given amount of load, but as an energy service to provide. Right. So I think we'd all agree that, big generation, which I've got here on the left, is those power plants, networks, homes and buildings and businesses, and now electric cars. Everyone would agree that's part of the power system. I think we'd also agree, if you go to the next slide, that appliances, and here let's pretend that's a dryer. Appliances are also sort of kind of part of the power system, although maybe not. I think, where the ISP right now looks really carefully at different assumptions about the way electric vehicles will charge and discharge out into the future. There's little and much less discussion about, other types of smart energy use, other types of demand response. And there are assumptions about efficiency, but and I'll talk a little bit more about those later, but how carefully do we really look at efficiency? If we go to the next slide, one way of looking at the power system and power system needs is that in order to meet power system needs, we don't have to buy a traditional dryer. We could buy a heat pump clothes dryer. And doing that would require less generation and less network to be built, maybe. Certainly if that happened en masse and across multiple appliances, that would provide a different way of meeting power system needs that might be least cost or lower cost than traditional generation and network solutions. Also, it can be faster to build, which is particularly important right now. So I think maybe I can persuade you all that this is all sort of within the bounds of power system needs. Let's take it even a step further, though. So if we go to the next slide, this might be even a bit radical for me, but for the thought experiment, it's like, where does this end? Because there's other ways to dry clothes, right? So we don't have to use the electricity system at all, or gas. You can also use a gas clothes dryer, but you don't have to use those at all. You can just use a clothesline. Likewise, while it's important to have a car for lots of people, not everyone needs a vehicle, and with better city planning, there can be better opportunities to bike and walk. Someone once told me that sidewalks are an energy efficient technology, or footpaths are an energy efficient technology. And so I think if we think that this might be too far for me, I'm not necessarily saying that the next iteration of the integrated system plan ought to be looking at opportunities for people to, increasingly dry their clothes on a line or walk and bike to work, but maybe it should. And if we can think more holistically about the way that we meet consumers' energy service needs, I think we have the best shot of giving consumers what they want, right? Which is an affordable, abundant, sustainable energy system. All right, so let's try and land this plane now. So if we and make it a little bit more tangible. So many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the Gen Costs report, which the line here at the bottom describes what it is. It's a collaboration between the CSIRO and AEMO to deliver an annual process of updating the cost of electricity generation, storage, and hydrogen production with strong emphasis on stakeholder engagement. It's great. I love Gen Costs. Comes out every year. There's a lot of information in there. There's a lot of costs for producing energy. It includes rooftop solar PV, which I don't know if you can see my cursor there, but it's on the right side, and it also includes battery storage of all sorts of different makes and models. But it doesn't include efficiency or smart energy use, right? It doesn't include these other ways that we can meet consumer needs. And so what if the and so as a result, the way that the ISP works, and I understand why it works this way, because it's difficult to do it other ways, although Josh is going to talk about some other ways of doing energy system planning. And anyway, there's ways in which you can, just as the Gen Cost report creates cost curves, supply cost curves for biomass, small scale biomass, or open cycle gas turbines, you can also create forward-looking cost curves for energy efficiency and smart energy use. It's common practice actually in other parts of the world, and then allow those resources to compete against traditional resources. So nearly there. One more slide, I think. So one of the themes of these series of webinars is kind of the interrelationship between planning and policy. And it's one of the reasons I'm really excited that the ISP team, or I'm sorry, that the DQ team has undertaken this review, because they've got the power not just to look at planning, which is clearly what they are looking at, but to think about the implications for planning on other parts of policy. So as we said last time, and as I want to make sure we reiterate every time, AEMO's integrated system plan is best in class in many ways, and it keeps getting better every time. So it's already a good process. And one of the things that I think is really nice about the 2023 inputs, assumptions, and scenarios report is they looked at a sensitivity where, and that's what this chart is on the right, where the dotted red line is the amount of energy efficiency assumed. So you could almost think of that should be like a negative line, but that's the amount of energy efficiency that is achieved in the orchestrated step change scenario. So that's kind of like the reference scenario. Those four kind of stacked bars, or that stacked part of the graph, are the existing policies that already exist, and how those are seen as playing out in the future. So there's basically this big gap. It doesn't look that big on the chart, I grant you, but there's this big gap between the existing policy regime and what is needed to achieve the efficiency assumptions in just sort of the medium case in the 2023 inputs and assumptions report. So you see at the bottom of this chart, there's all of these different colors. The reason that more of them aren't shown is because they're minimal or non-existent in this sort of sensitivity where we assume no new policies. And so it doesn't look like a big difference in this chart, but it's a material difference. So just in 10 years from now, that sensitivity showed that there's 3,600 gigawatt hours less energy from efficiency than we get under the step change scenario. That's twice as many homes as there are, more than twice as many homes as there are in the state of Tasmania, right? So basically take all the Tasmanians off, all Tasmanian households off the grid twice over, or provide them with energy in a clean, sustainable, affordable way. But we need to get the policy part of this right if we're going to do it. So maybe that all seems a little bit radical. Anymore, it seems like if you want to talk to radicals, you got to go to the US, because people think differently there. Certainly, even from the time when I was there. And a radical American that we've got with us today is my friend Josh Keeling. So I've known Josh for a long time. So he's going to talk today. We'll have 2 more webinars after this. So Josh and I work together at Portland General Electric, which is a vertically integrated utility in the Pacific Northwest. He's an energy planner and an energy doer. He's written and helped design these potential studies for demand response programs for things like hot water demand response programs, and then actually gone out and built and designed those and sold them to customers. He's also kind of worked all over the place. His latest venture is a company called UtilityAPI. He also serves as an adjunct professor at Portland State University, where he teaches a course all focused on the smart grid. We're real lucky to have him. Thanks for spending your time with us, Josh.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to talk about this stuff. First, I just want to let folks know where I am. As Brian mentioned, I am in Portland, Oregon. That is, as he described before the call, the Canada of California. So we are just north of California. I was born and raised here in Portland, Oregon, which is within the Willamette Valley, which is the original lands for 11,000 years of the Chinookan-speaking people, which includes the tribes of Clackamas, Cathlamet, Multnomah, Tualatin, and several other tribes along the Columbia River Gorge and Valley. And I am grateful to have get to call this a home and respectfully acknowledge the elders and those who came before me who had their lands taken from them, but have left behind rich and important culture and just a beautiful place to live. Okay, so let's get into it. So I'm going to cover at a high level 3 areas today. One is just a history of demand side planning in the US, which is honestly evolving quite a bit in the last few years, but there's particularly in the energy efficiency and demand response, there's a pretty rich foundation of analytical tools and policies that have been put in place at the state and increasingly at the federal level. And then I'm going to talk in a little bit more detail just about different tools that are in place. So different modeling techniques, different approaches, and how those are used to integrate into integrated resource planning or in market planning studies in our organized markets. And then briefly talk about, and we'll transition into the panel, some conversation just about potential applications to the ISP, how the ISP context differs a bit from the US and where there are similarities. Okay, next slide. So Brian kind of covered this, but just a quick bit about me. I lead market development and product here at UtilityAPI. UtilityAPI is a software platform that does DER integration, largely solar and now increasingly in electrification. And as Brian mentioned, I'm a very slowly recovering resource planner and energy analytics nerd. Spent quite a bit of time working in planning studies, both at the wholesale level and then also at the distribution level. So first, just talking about how we got to the point where we have what we call integrated resource planning in the US, which the integrated part of that is meant to be that we are integrating supply with demand. So historically, in the 80s and early 90s, much of the resource planning was done treating demand as fully exogenous. That is, we had to meet demand. It was a constraint to be met. It was inelastic, and supply resources were built based on the supply curve, and the whole goal was to meet demand in the least cost risk way. However, they're particularly coming out of the energy crisis, and then with increasing success with codes and standards at the federal and state levels, particularly in California, there's growing recognition of the importance of energy efficiency in particular as a resource. But because of the regulated nature and the way that those resources are able to show up, they are not able to express the elasticity of demand directly within those markets. And therefore you have a market asymmetry. And a policy mechanism that was taken in many states, particularly in the Western United States and Northeast states of the United States, were what are called energy efficiency resource standards. And those are similar to what later came as the renewable portfolio standards. And these were requirements to acquire a set amount of energy efficiency based on some threshold amount, cost effectiveness criteria. We've seen a further expansion of that through the use of what are called performance incentive mechanisms, or PIMs. These are mechanisms that are used to provide shareholder incentives to investor-owned utilities to incentivize them to acquire demand-side resources in some measure. Even more recently, we've started to see this move beyond the integrated resource planning context, the wholesale level, and starting to be incorporated into what are called like integrated distribution resource planning. So that is using demand-side resources not only for wholesale but also distribution. But at the highest level, the intention of this is to ensure that consumers are able to capture value and lower costs on a level or as close to a level playing field as possible with standard supply side and demand. Next slide. And Carol, I saw there was a question. Did you want to address these as they come, or do you want to just go through?
We can take the questions after them. Yeah.
Okay, great. So an important concept here, and this is a very busy slide, but just to show how much analysis goes into these, is a concept of a resource loading order and developing demand side supply curves, similar to what you would see, say, in the gen cost study. So as a means to help compensate for some of the asymmetries, many states will use what's called a resource loading order, which basically says, I am going to prioritize specific types of resources, and within some threshold cost against, like, say, a base load or peaking capacity resource, I'm going to acquire all of the resources within that stack. So this happened initially with energy efficiency, and increasingly has been taken on with distributed energy resources, most notably demand response. You are seeing variants of this take place as well as you start to incorporate other policy objectives, whether that be equity considerations, resilience, things that environmental impacts that may not show up within a standard resource adequacy or like bulk system reliability context. What's interesting is that this sort of, when you take a resource loading order, you can be a bit lazy in your analysis. You're really looking at a threshold at that point, saying, I'm going to take a benchmark of weighted cost resource, whether that's a peaking gas plant or a coal plant or a transmission build, whatever that constraint may be, and say, okay, based on some levelized cost capacity, anything below that, I'm going to acquire. In recent years, we've started to see analysis that does something more like what you see on the right. So the example on the right, which is taken from Portland General Electric, is a supply curve that looks at every single demand side resource that can provide capacity and its levelized cost. And you can sort of go along that and see increasing megawatts. The interesting thing in that is that you can actually end up, because of the value that some of these demand side resources provide, you actually run into specific resources that actually have negative cost because they provide some amount of value, whether that's rate relief or they have very low implementation cost or highly behavioral or naturally occurring, and it's just some small behavior change. You can get highly cost-effective resources. The value here in doing this loading order approach as well gets to when I'm going to talk in a second a bit about portfolio analysis and looking at finer grain and how you look at those resources. There are interesting interactions as you look at different seasonal needs or different flexibility requirements as you take on a variable renewable resources. Next slide, Carol. Thank you. So in terms of the resources that are considered, we've talked a bit about energy efficiency. Typically, this is modeled across two different approaches. One, similar to what we see with the ISP, is sort of called naturally adopted. So that's stock turnover that happens, and then the implementation of codes and standards that are already on the books, but not decided within the context of the planning study. that roll out and result in changing energy efficiency levels. That's separate from what's called acquired resources. So acquired resources are where the utility or the regional body or the market makes, or the policymaker makes a decision to take on incremental resources in response to needs that are shown within that planning study. And that's sort of the paradigm that I discussed on the previous slide. Similarly, demand response resources have been for a long time out there, and I'm sort of using the Big Tent definition of demand response. So that is like load shifting, flexibility, time of use rates even sometimes are modeled within these, as well as things like thermal storage. Rooftop solar has for a number of years been modeled directly. We of course have much lower penetration levels than you all have down under, aside from maybe in Hawaii. Those are almost always, even today, modeled as naturally adopted. Though you are starting to see in some locational studies where that's being acquired directly by utilities in response to, say, localized reliability requirements. In contrast, customer-sited storage, we're seeing both modeled as a naturally occurring resource and then also as a acquired resource where it's used to target capacity similar to a demand response resource. Additionally, sort of on the bottom level, and this gets to the sort of multi-sector, multi-fuel conversation where there is a jurisdictional scope beyond just electricity. You start to see electrification, both of buildings and transportation, not only being of course modeled as naturally occurring, but either being acquired or perhaps guided as in its deployment. That is, either acquiring the resources in the case of, say, natural gas shortages, which are a major issue. There are many natural gas distribution transmission issues in the Northeast of the United States, or in the case of mitigating the impacts of transportation electrification, complementary measures. So whether that's flexible loads being accompanied with those resources, or vehicle to grid technologies or things like that. Next slide. So I'm going to cover at a high level a few approaches. The bedrock of this is potential studies and sort of market assessment. So how you characterize the stock, how you model the potential to acquire resources. And then I'll touch on sort of some of the post-study tools that are used, such as scenario analysis, portfolio analysis, and locational analysis. Many of these look similar to what you would see in a standard sort of supply-side study of resources. But I want to touch on some of the nuances there because there's some interesting interactions in some of those resources. Next slide. So market assessment, and this is where we see in the ISP today. There's a rich amount of analysis that's already been done, though there's always areas where we can potentially improve. The top part of this, which is pretty clear, is this sort of foundational research around stock assessment. So characterizing all of the buildings of different types, the types of appliances that are in homes, and then factoring in things like customer preferences. So an example where I am, historically, the Pacific Northwest did not have air conditioning. That was not a thing. It was a luxury, not a necessity. However, over the last few years, it has become actually a public safety issue as temperatures have become quite dangerous at peaks in the summer for us. And so suddenly we see where we have a base stock of pretty low penetration of air conditioning. Customer preferences and changing climate leads to a stock that we see growing substantially over a pretty short period of time. Another important aspect of this is willingness to pay. So considerations about how customers and different types of customers might respond. This is really important in terms of how we think about segmentation as well. So what types of customers are where can be really critical here. It can be dangerous to make assumptions about that preferences are evenly distributed across the system, particularly when you see widely disparate impacts across the network. However, where this differs is when you start looking at the lower sections. So Once you start moving towards a potential studies framework, market assessments also include serving intervention methods. So that could be policies, but often it's also direct programs. So those are rebates or direct install programs where either a utility, a service provider, a community-based organization, municipality even might deploy resources to actually recruit customers and deliver those. How those programs are designed really affects how you expect them to be adopted, who you expect them to be adopted by, and how cost effective they are. So a market assessment will take a stock of comparable interventions and say, what are best practices? What do we expect to see for those programs? So like in the example that Brian had given, if you were to look at a water heater program, there are a lot of ways that program, that same resource from a technology perspective could be delivered. We see cases where those are done upstream with communications like through manufacturers. It's a very low intervention method, but requires broad coordination. Whereas you also see programs that are more retrofit programs where control technology is deployed, say, within multifamily homes or housing developments, and that's a much different cost profile and adoption profile. Similarly, you would look at emerging technologies. So especially when you're looking at long-term studies, you want to take a look at what technologies are on the horizon because you're making long-term decisions. So that's often another area of focus. And in some cases, you may even see primary market research. So cases of going out and understanding customers' willingness to engage in these resources. Next slide, Carl. So the core of this is to build into a potential study. A potential study effectively goes beyond the market, the stock assessment, and says, okay, we need to look at from the total stock, what technologies and interventions are not feasible, and we will screen those out. So that is, they may not fit in. You may be looking at, say, specific HVAC technology that's reliant on ducting, and for a given population, that ducting doesn't exist. So that's not feasible. We would screen that out. Then from there, you're looking at what your total interventions possible are, what are called technical potential. Technical potential is if we were God and we could just go in and force everything to happen, this is the total amount of resource that we could get. From there, we factor in some of the market research and what we see for best practices. We break down into, what are the market barriers? What is actually going to be adopted? And that gets us to something more like achievable potential, which is looking at what could actually potentially be adopted, given the reality of the market, that we're not dictators forcing technologies on folks. And then from there, you can break further and to look at what is economic from a system perspective, that is, what performs better than the alternate resource and what doesn't. And in the past, it used to be that we, in that sort of loading order perspective, we would just screen out the rest of it and throw it out. Increasingly, because of the unexpected results we see in portfolio analysis, those are often kept in and said, okay, this is the first priority. We'll put in these economic resources that are a slam dunk. But we're going to look at these other resources and keep them in because there may be these long tail scenarios where you have unusual characteristics and they may actually prove to be cost effective under certain conditions. Next slide. So cost effectiveness, we could spend 3 hours just talking about this, but when we talk about cost effectiveness, fundamentally, we can look at a number of factors. It's much more complicated when you get to demand side resources because you have to factor in that they are installed at some point. They're installed often for a different reason than helping to support the grid. So we don't choose to put in an efficient appliance because we want to help the grid. That's a secondary benefit to the fact that we just want, hot showers and cold beers. So really, you don't want to attribute the full value of that intervention, charge the whole refrigerator or the whole, water heater to the grid. It needs to be allocated between the customer's value and the grid's value. And that's a pretty nuanced and complicated factor. Additionally, depending on your policy objectives, you may factor in other things as well, such as equity, distributional impacts, et cetera, et cetera. Next slide. Additionally, and this is an important one, particularly when we talk about energy efficiency, is how you characterize that resource. So the reason often that solar is adopted more frequently than energy efficiency is it's much more obvious where your benefit comes from. You are generating power and it's relatively reliable to estimate how much I'm going to save from that investment. Energy efficiency is effectively creating energy by using less, and therefore has to be measured against the baseline. Luckily, there's been decades of work into sort of building out standard practices for this, much more data-driven than they had been in the past. But this is an important consideration when you talk about how you characterize it in study. Next slide. So scenario analysis is an important one as well. The important point that I want to touch on here for demand side resources vis-a-vis a broader study is to make sure that you're actually coupling your assumptions in your scenario analysis. So one dangerous thing you'll see happen sometimes is that a study will be done for the demand side and a study will be done for the supply side, and their scenarios are not actually mapped to each other. So, and this is really important, especially now, because there are a lot of entanglements that happen in different decisions that are made both in the demand side and the supply side. The most obvious being things like fuel prices. So the degree to which folks electrify is in some measure a function of fuel prices, both on the petrol side and on the grid side. And so making sure that you're aligning those factors is really critical. Similarly, macroeconomic factors can have impacts on things like population, energy use, industries. It's really critical that you get that both in the demand side and in the demand side, like both from a load forecast side, but also from a demand side resource characterization perspective. Next slide. So portfolio analysis is an incredibly complicated area. And I think the complications that you see in integrating the demand side resources, which are often very diverse and fine-grained, is part of the reason that historically we sort of took this approach where we just chopped it all off first. We sort of subtract all of the things that come in loaded first, and then we just have a net load forecast, and then we incorporate that into a portfolio analysis of supply side resources. However, because you're seeing so much more interaction between the demand side and the supply side, now we're starting to see a lot more analysis where at least some sort of bin of different resources based on a characteristic or cost profile are used to create bundles of demand side resources that can be then put in and sort of look like a synthetic generator within a broader portfolio analysis. And this is really important because when you start to see seasonal effects, where it may be, say, for instance, you have a need for summer demand for a certain period of time, but then once you get far enough down that low duration curve, you transition, you start suddenly needing winter resources. If you just take a ham-handed approach and cut it off, you can miss some of that nuance, and that's really important. Next slide. The newest sort of area where this is the analysis is sort of being expanded is in locational analysis. This is very difficult in a lot of ways, both from an analytic perspective and also just from like a jurisdictional and coordination perspective, because often the bodies that conduct planning on the wholesale side are completely disentangled from those that conduct on the distribution side. So it's not surprising in the US that you see most of the development here happen within vertically integrated utilities where they have a common integration point and can discuss holistically how to deploy those resources. But at a minimum, something to consider is factoring in, at least from a net cost perspective, when you evaluate these resources. For instance, where you have load shifting resources or resources that help increase self-consumption on the solar side, the important part is to just capture that net benefit, even if at a high level. So the avoided distribution capacity value, or the avoided upgrades that may take place from less reverse power flow, okay, across, say, the TD interface. Next slide. So just to sort of wrap, I wanted to talk a little bit about application CISP, but we can talk about this in the panel as well. mean, I think the critical thing here is that the way the ISP is approaching these issues today is fundamentally assuming to some extent an exogeneity of demand side resources from supply side resources. That is, it's treating it as an external factor that it cannot be tweaked within the resource planning decisions. Integrating that more so through like a potential study approach can be really helpful in getting a more holistic view and responsive to some of the changing dynamics that you see from a supply side. The good news is, I think, is that there's a ton of analysis that's already been done that provides a really strong foundation. So the incremental lift of doing some of this work, I don't think is nearly as high as you would see in some other places. But this is a really critical way of both keeping costs low and taking advantage of the consumer engagement and demand that you're already seeing on rooftop solar side, leveraging that for the next set of resources that you really need to see. Next slide. So as you sort of like, if you were to go down this path, some of the things that are really important to consider is one, just the selection of a proxy resource. So what we call an avoided cost resource. So that is, to take the first step, it's usually typically easiest to say, what is a benchmark resource, say from the Gen Cost study, that a demand side resource might be competing against, like a market clearing or baseline clearing resource. Take that resource and use it to at least do a top level analysis of demand side resources. The other is to think about, particularly as you look at these very high penetrations of rooftop solar and then potentially electrification, some proxy estimates or initial like sense of where distribution value might be to understand how to adjust those planning values. But then the messy part of this in any analysis of demand side resources is how does this interact with retailers, of course, and the retail value proposition, because the primary value proposition in most demand side resources is not to provide value to the grid, it is some other value. So there's a need to coordinate some measure, or at least ensure that there's no conflicting interests in the deployment of those resources. And that usually is dealt with within like policy intervention analysis or program design. And then that gets to the last point, just thinking about delivery channels. From a fresh start, I think there are a lot of options for how resources can be deployed. And so that's something to think about as you sort of go farther down this analysis. That's it. Yeah, and I've left some links at the end. I think we'll be sharing the presentation. So if folks have any interest, there's some good case studies here of just both single utilities, statewide, and then federal studies, and then some discussion just on methods and policy approaches.
Thanks a lot, Josh.
Yeah, totally.
So time for a panel discussion. So let me introduce Andrew Turley, who's the Group Manager of Forecasting at the Australian Energy Market Operator, and Kirsty Rolls, who's the Acting Manager of the ISP at the Q at the Commonwealth Department, who's responsible for that, which is part of the National Energy Transformation Division. So I'll give you two a bit of time to catch your breath here and think about a question. Josh and I I know Josh has had to deal with lots of people who are wary of his ideas about the ability of all this crazy consumer stuff to actually make a difference. And I've heard a lot of those questions too, so I can try and just rip them off. But I guess one question I wanted to ask. Oh, yeah. So what about the reliability of this stuff, Josh? I mean, like we put in a new battery, a new big scale battery and solar system. Those have pretty good track records. Consumers are different types of people. What if they need a hot shower, or they just want to increase the temperature of their of their home, or I'm sorry, decrease the temperature of their home, despite the fact that you've paid them money to participate in a demand response program. Like, there's a reliability benefit or reliability assumption about sort of standard supply side resources. How is it that demand side resource can compete when it isn't as reliable?
Well, there's a lot of nuance in how you treat it, and it depends on the resource. So when you look at energy efficiency, often you do benefit from one thing, which is just the same thing that makes it so that we can forecast load in the first place, which is just diversity, right? Like, so you get a lot of load diversity. That helps to sort of smooth out. You're going to have some customers who don't really save that much. You have some customers who save a lot, but you should, over time, sort of have the law of large numbers in your favor. But particularly when you get into dispatchable resources, I think it's really important to consider the operating characteristics of those resources. Typically, what you'll see is in these studies, you'll do what's called like a D rate or an adjustment factor, which effectively says, if I had a perfectly performing capacity resource, it would give me, this profile. I have a demand side resource, and for whatever reason, call limitations, et cetera, it can't perform the same way, and you'll adjust it. However, despite those adjustments, you'll still see, much very cost-effective resources in many cases. And then the last part I would just say, like, we have empirical evidence that they're quite reliable, because the United States and many other countries have gigawatts of these resources that have provided emergency capacity relief under pretty strange scenarios. A great example I like to give is the hundreds of thousands of grid interactive water heaters or water heater switches that have been in Florida, maintaining transmission reliability in that state for since the 80s, like back when they were operating on pager networks. That was done without any policy intervention. It was just dealing with the fact that there was such a constrained area, and those resources have been operating for quite a long time.
Yeah, thanks for that. So there's a few questions that have come through the chat. Please ask more questions. This is a better discussion with more, because I've got lots of questions, but the better ones I think are going to come from the audience or from our panel. So Andrew, what do you think?
Thanks, Brian. Look, it's certainly a big challenge, and as as somebody who has led the modeling efforts for the ISP for all of the ISPs that we've had, balancing and incorporating demand resources as part of that optimization problem has been an ever-present problem or ever-present challenge for modelers, and an ever-present sort of need and desire for consumers to know that they're part of this transformed system. One of the significant reasons why we take the approach that we take with looking at forecasting demand is to realize that as system planners, grid planners, we certainly have a role in forecasting the scale of energy that's going to be needed, and then identify how best to achieve that. And most recently, in particular, we've certainly recognized that energy efficiency is a big pillar in the decarbonization sort of options for us. A big part of how we do our demand forecasting and scenario planning more generally is to ensure that the scenarios themselves acknowledge and accommodate the sorts of demand responses that could come through under different scenarios. So when we look at the scale of electrification, when we look at the opportunity for consumers to continue to invest in rooftop PV systems and continue to invest in electric vehicles, and Teslas you see these days is getting to be quite impressive. But there is certainly an opportunity there. There's always, though, a question about how much control, how effective can central planners be in assuming and expecting that consumers be influenced to deliver these in the same respects that regulated or non-regulated market assets, utility scale assets can deliver. So it's not so much a question, but certainly I'm interested, I guess, in that journey that you've seen in the States, in that I guess traditional integrated resource planning, which has taken a similar approach where we look at demand as a number to be met. And what was the tipping point, I guess, for then shifting to a more so I guess endogenous method for incorporating this, because it's a classic challenge that Portland at least is moved in its way of incorporating this, and certainly there's been calls for quite some time to try to do something similar. What was the tipping point for you in seeing more of this action?
I mean, the unfortunate thing is that usually and this was the case in the initial, there's been sort of multiple generations of like demand side incorporation. Fortunately, they almost always start with a disaster. So they always start with like, we're just short. And then there's, the oldest form of demand side management we all know, which is you just start having rolling brownouts. And so almost every one of those has started there. And that's unfortunate because the best way to deploy these resources is to take a long run view and think of it sort of like a hedge, right? Like you're gonna invest in these demand side resources, and you're not gonna know for any year when I'm gonna get them. But it's especially when you go after the sort of low hanging fruit, which like is where a lot of the energy efficiency really got kicked off. It's almost a no regrets investment, because they're like, I'm pretty sure this is cost effective all the time, and I could just it starts to feed itself after a while. So the incremental cost there's these economies of scale that come from the programmatic deployments. They're really helpful. What's dangerous is when you wait till you absolutely need something, and then you start like, oh, we should scale up a demand, like an energy efficiency portfolio. It's like, well, it's going to take 5 years to build that up. Like it's going to take, there's a lot of institutional work building up organizations. And that's not to say don't do it. It's like, okay, you're going to do it, but don't expect it to bail you out tomorrow. But you're going to have another disaster after this one, and you're going to and after that. So it's a really sound like portfolio approach to have this diversified portfolio where it's like, I'm going to invest in the big resources, but I'm going to have in the background these small demand side resources growing, building, especially now with electrification. So like to your point about electrification, what's interesting in the US is we had sort of tapped out the low hanging fruit in efficiency. A lot of the appliance stuff, lighting, things like that. And so there was this narrative before electrification had taken on that it was like, oh, this is the death of energy efficiency. And then building electrification and transportation happened. It was like, oh my God, we need efficiency more than ever, because we're putting all this new electric load on and make sure that's efficient. Otherwise, we're going to be in another, we're going to find ourselves with another capacity situation down the road.
And the thing I might add, so and Kirsty, I'm going to send it to you, but I do know some of the history. So Portland, Oregon, right? So you sort of mentioned, Andrew, that Portland's doing this. I guess I would just emphasize that Oregon is like one of 30 or 35 of the 50 states that goes out and acquires demand side resources and incorporates them into their planning. So it did start in the Pacific Northwest. It started in basically because the Pacific Northwest, that part of the world, right? That's where Boeing is. And that's because during World War II, they built a bunch of hydropower that made energy extremely cheap. They built all the World War II airplanes there. And then Boeing came, and basically like hydro was too cheap to meter forever. People had like the most inefficient electricity system in the world. People had all these electric heaters, like really like resistance electric heat. And then eventually it ran out. The population grew, and all of a sudden people started having to pay for electricity. And it was kind of like a crisis in the Pacific Northwest around, oh, what are we going to build? There was at that time, this is like the 70s, maybe a little bit later than that, but let's build some nuclear. That fell over. And then there was sort of this need. One of the interesting things is because the Pacific Northwest went early on that, a lot of, like Josh is an expert in this for lots of reasons, but one of which is because there's an ecosystem in that part of the US of these third-party companies that actually go and roll out the efficiency programs in the rest of the country. So it's really like there was a particular policy, it was policy driven in in response to these energy crises to in part of the country to say we need to get really serious about efficiency, and that created this long-term industry really where most of the efficiency professionals live in Portland, not because, I mean, Portland has a very temperate climate. It actually is like pretty easy to and really cheap electricity because there still is a lot of hydro. So anyway, but it has to be part of a bigger policy discussion, because I appreciate the fact that, you know, just as in that sensitivity analysis that you've done this year, you show there's this gap between kind of forecast and what policy can meet. And if you're depending upon these resources in lieu of going out and building transmission and generation, you better be, you know, certain that they're going to come online. And so you need this this delivery channel to it. So it's a challenging, it's a more holistic challenge than just planning alone, I think, can solve. I'm talking too much. Kirsty, what do you reckon?
Brian, if you don't mind, I might just jump in there, because I think that is actually a really good reflection on what is within the ISP, and particularly within our scenario planning approach. There is a level of existing policy across federal and state jurisdictions and so forth, that are driving energy efficiency solutions, building standards, building codes, appliance standards, etc., and more direct programs to really build and encourage consumers to invest in energy efficiency uptakes of various sorts. The scenarios that we deploy certainly look at taking existing policies, and then also, and if anybody's read the 173-page ISR, then well done. And if you've recognized that there's also dozens of other supporting materials, and kudos to you as well, with other reports. But a lot of the work that we look at in terms of energy efficiency also looks at, well, what other policy extensions could there be beyond current policy, and what autonomous or market-led energy efficiency could come through as well. So the gap, if you like, between where current policy is and where the forecast level of energy efficiency is in some scenarios varies, depending on the thematics of the scenarios. As you said, Josh, you know, it's important that the scenarios on supply and demand sort of are consistent, and that's what we certainly endeavor to do. And so the appropriate approach is to recognize that there is opportunity for continued policy change and policy growth, and to deliver more, I'm going to say more energy efficiency, or to effectively rely upon that growth in either economic efficiency that's market driven, that's just simply it's a good thing for you to do because it's just cheaper to buy an energy efficiency appliance rather than something that is being mandated to you. So that growth of energy efficiency is there for that reason, to ensure that we're not overbuilding the system to cater for a load that doesn't eventuate because it's, in hindsight, geez, it was obvious that we should have put in the best of our appliances rather than an old window rattler air conditioning system that maybe was good way back when. So certainly I think the thematics of what we're describing is actually well and truly part of the scenario planning approach, and because it is often so, as you say, sort of policy driven to then go and procure it, the ISP is expecting that the policies that are there will in fact then lead to actions that then go and procure it. But I thought it'd be worth clarifying that there are that's the reason for gaps, is because passive consumers just don't exist.
Yeah, right on. Thanks for that, Andrew. Kirsty, I want to make sure that you have a chance to contribute, and then we've got lots of questions coming in, so that's great. Keep them coming. Yep.
No worries. Thanks, Brian. I actually have a question just in terms of, I think a lot of attention is given to the assumptions that AEMO sort of put on demand and CER uptake in the ISP. So a bit of a question on, what we would be expecting to see improved in that space. Is it better assumptions? Is it better analysis? Or should it go further than that? And then I've sort of got a second part of that question around distribution network planning. So obviously they have a sort of a greater role in demand side planning. But obviously at that point now it's sort of more focused on sort of demand management rather than CER orchestration. So I just wonder as well if you think, that side of thing needs improvement. Is there more sort of incentives that we need to provide distribution network service providers to sort of orchestrate CER more?
Great questions. I can take a shot at them, but Josh, do you want to comment on it? I don't know how much that even translates, but yeah.
No, it does. I mean, I think on the first question, it was just around assumptions versus anything else. I mean, you can always improve the assumptions and like the analysis, but I mean, especially like in this context, I don't think that's the biggest issue. It's like always an issue, but it's not the biggest issue. The harder part is, re-examining the scope of the study itself, or like what are the options that can go into the study. And that's like, I cannot tell you, I mean, and I've been in this position myself, like how many times as a modeler, you're like, well, this is what you told me to do, and I'm doing my best, given the constraints that I've been. But at some point you have to say, okay, well, your option set is different, or we need to also consider this other thing, or take it, change the paradigm a bit. And I think those are the hardest things to spot on the margins, but are the most impactful. So like looking at new intervention options, that's not, a modeler doesn't typically do that. That is a bigger conversation. So finding a way to sort of like open that setup is a bigger conversation. On the distribution side, I think it's just trying to connect those two. So like there's no perfect way to do it, but at least acknowledging and finding whether it's an incentive on the wholesale side to the distribution side or vice versa, something where you can better connect to ensure that like where there's synergistic value, it's being expressed together, because it's often not.
Yeah, and so maybe I'll jump in a little bit because this is all sort of my crazy idea to have Josh come and talk about all these things that are like on the border of within the scope of your review. But I'm trying to broaden the ambition of this whole thing, right? So that was our idea all along. So distribution planning, maybe I think Josh said something, that's the whole focus of the next webinar. So I'll save that for then. I think on the idea here, I think Andrew sort of pointed to it actually, was so if you look at the ISP, that purpose is great and ambitious and a whole of system plan. But if you actually look at like the lever then, or the impact that the ISP has on articulating and delivering a plan, it's really isolated exclusively to transmission development. It really has only a causal relationship on building new power lines or not, or building them later or something. It doesn't actually impact any other resource decision. Indirectly, it probably does. So, for example, the capacity investment scheme that's being developed now looks very similar to some of the modeling that came out of the ISP about the needs for utility scale storage by 2030. What it doesn't do, what it has historically never done, is there's never been a clear line between, to achieve this least cost future that we all like the 2022 ISP step change scenario that, ECA has modeled through our stepping up report and shown kind of what are the long-term customer benefits of that, which are significant. What are the demand side policy interventions or choices that need to be made consistent with that future? So, for example, the 2022 ISP assumes that between now and 2030, there's going to be an additional like 4 gigawatts of distributed batteries. Like, where is the link between that identified need, or that, like, to meet our energy, like, we're only building so much transmission and generation under the assumption that 4 gigawatts or whatever it is of small scale batteries exists. But then there's no follow through on that whole part of the equation, that whole consumer part of the equation, and how do we actually bring those resources to bear? So one way of doing it is this way that Josh has sort of articulated, where you're actually much more sort of intentional about the ways in which those resources can compete. But that's kind of like somewhat is what Josh was saying. It's kind of on the margins. I don't even know if that makes that big of a difference, as much as choosing what he was calling delivery channels, which is really like, who's going to do it? And so maybe that would be a distribution network, to kind of connect that to your second point. I'm talking too much. We've got 10 questions and not enough time to get to them. Jill Caney asked a question in 2 parts. So, which was, first, I love demand side response, but even the ECA's own surveys suggest automation and, quote, control are unwelcome. Tariffs can be complex for customers to understand. My question is, flexibility is very desirable for the system. So how do we make it easy for customers in the face of many challenges? So Josh, I take that however you want, either as a sort of someone who's tried to design these programs, or how you accommodate for that lack of, that willingness or unwillingness of consumers to participate in planning.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a firm believer that this is why you need to have a diverse portfolio. So even things that might seem redundant in some cases, so that is like, you might have a direct automation option out there, but then you might also have a tariff option, and you might also have just some what we call sort of non-firm behavioral, which is like, something where we just on an event basis send something out as a request, or like in California they're called like flex alerts, where there's just like engagement with customers during really extreme events. What's dangerous is if you bank on one way of approaching the problem, because it's always fragile. There's always some segment of customer that it's not going to work for, and you could just be wrong in your study. And so, like, attacking the problem in a diverse way, diverse set of technologies, but also diverse way of going to market, I think is really helpful. That's something we've benefited from, I would say, in the U.S. is, most of the work that's done on these programs is done at the state level, which is exhausting in a lot of ways. But the advantage to that is you have about 50 laboratories to fail in. And so we get to learn from each of the failures. And I would definitely encourage you, as you sort of think about intervention strategies, to learn from all the failures that we've had, because we've had plenty, and it's evolving all the time. But
yeah, thanks for that, Josh. Keep these questions coming. We'll do our best to sort of answer them offline. And I think it's helpful for everybody to see them as well, just for the other panelists, and we can, and ECA can take some of this into our own advocacy around the ISP review. Okay, so one of the questions, I'm going to just kind of make this a very long question, because there's 2 different parts to it. So this top level question is, the National Electricity Law doesn't regulate how a house is designed and wired, or what appliances people can install. It probably shouldn't. These things are covered by state legislation. What role do you see for coordination between state and market bodies, and how might that be achieved? And then there's this follow-up question, or because there's additional questions along this theme that really is about the ISP, that asks, how can government policy best impact and drive the transition for the consumer? But they're going to connect this to modeling. So have you been able to model policy outcomes within the ISP to test the impact and sensitivity of those policy impacts, so that robust policy could be established? Do you find any cases where the approach to planning has successfully driven policy decisions? That's a broader question, maybe for you, Josh, towards the end. But Andrew, I don't know if you wanted to take any bit of that around the ISP.
It's a really good question. And I actually wonder whether Kirsty's got a different or complementary view to what I'll add. Fundamentally, we do, as a sort of saying, we do forecast a level of consumer response, and then build around it as at a high level. That's kind of what we've been describing. There's 2 sensitivities in the current inputs, assumptions, scenarios report. You referred to one of them, Brian, with regards to the low energy efficiency sensitivity. And we'll be working that and another sensitivity around consumer energy resource orchestration through this 2024 ISP. And the purpose of those sensitivities that we'll be simulating yet to see the results of is to understand what impact, what cost, what infrastructure would need to be delivered in this whole everything's exogenous approach, and therefore build it if it doesn't come naturally. So in essence, the purpose that we'll be seeing in that sensitivity analysis is to see the value of greater energy efficiency success, or greater consumer energy resource orchestration success, i.e. The ability to expect batteries to operate to mitigate requirements of the grid, as opposed to operating to just manage household loads and so forth. So I'm anticipating that that will reveal a lot of savings that consumers can expect to come through with successful orchestration of resources, or with successful deployment of energy efficiency solutions, to then encourage, I guess, continued adoption of policies that drive at least these outcomes, and maybe more, depending upon the scale of savings that come through relative to what the utility scale solutions are. Certainly, across the history, we see progressive step ups in policy, and I'm sure the governments that trigger those have done their own evaluations of how successful previous energy efficiency policies are and so forth, and relating it to things like the ISP or the ISP itself. But certainly the 2024 ISP will give us a lot more transparency around avoided investment with some of those policy sensitivities.
No one else is jumping up, and there's a lot of questions. So let's keep going. I think the one thing I would add or just mention is that separate to this ISP review, right? The Kirsty and the rest of the team there in Canberra is quite busy, right? And so there's this National Energy Performance Strategy, the NEPS as it's called, that really is focused on kind of consumer resources, demand side resources, and how, and part of that is quite explicit about the use of planning to set targets. So it may be that some of this discussion actually gets sort of carried through, not through the ISP review, but through that NEPS, that National Energy Performance Strategy. All right, we got a question from the one and only Mark Patterson. From a whole system operation point of view, firmness of response is a critical requirement. Isn't a key challenge the fact that we don't yet have a clear view of how we operationally coordinate a power system served by tens of millions of resources? This has got to be a problem that crosses the pond, Josh. So I'll just leave that one open.
We could spend a lot of time talking about this, but I mean, one thing I want to know in what Mark is sort of getting at is that, and I think that we're seeing is a sort of paradigm shift in the US around flexibility resources specifically, is I think historically there was this notion that you would have either aggregator led or utility led, or like system operator led dispatch of resources. And then it would be active management. Like you would have active management across the entire system. And that still has a place. But as we've sort of seen in practice, some of these operational coordination issues have really inhibited growth or utilization of like this wide array of resources that are out there, either because of like the lack of underlying systems. So like having a DERMS that can like talk up and down between the distribution network and the wholesale networks. But then the
DERMS is a DER management system.
Sorry, yes, that's right. But the other problem is the customer preference, right? So like you just have issues where customers are like, I'm happy to provide you some flexibility, but I want to have control over it. So I'm not willing to give external control, but I would shift like my baseline operations in some way. So like a good example of this is like how smart inverters are starting to be used, where I think originally there was this idea of like, oh, they're going to be actively managed by the operators. That in practice is not happening. Like, but what is happening is at least changing the set points of those inverters as they go out based on the specific grid conditions that they're in, and that gets you 80% of the value with like no operational coordination. There's very little operational coordination aside from interconnect. So we're seeing a lot of that in, say, load flexibility, where it's like moving more towards like daily load shifting and like simple time of use rates or self-consumption schemes, which are not perfect, but get you a lot of the way. And then you've reduced the overall need for something that needs to be operationally coordinated and hopefully reduce that problem space.
So this is an interesting discussion. You touched on these inverter standards, which is a whole other ball of worms here in Australia, because the installers don't, like, the manufacturers do it, but the installers don't always. I think there's and actually some of the comments that are coming in that are well received, even if we don't ask about them, are basically like, just let the market solve all this. And a lot of this sort of daily time of use stuff is more apparent in the national electricity market in Australia than it is in most parts of the US, and any of those 35 states that really I was mentioning. So I think it's fair to say that some of what Josh is saying is this is coming on now in the US is actually in many ways existing practice, or is in one way or another kind of built into the system here. And that's just a result of a different regulatory regime. All right, I want to get as many of these questions as we can. We were hopeful.
Can I
go, Josh?
I just want to hit on an Australian specific example. Like, so an example of this would be like, you could have an aggregator, like a VPP, sort of virtual power plant approach to dispatching resources. The other thing you could do is look at like how you tweak how dynamic operating envelopes are used for like exporting resources. And if those incorporated more of the wholesale conditions into how the dynamic operating envelope was, that's a way in which you're not actually directly controlling the resource. The resource is doing a more net beneficial approach, as opposed to building envelopes that are based on the distribution network needs. Incorporating some value there is a great example of something where that's not a program. It's not direct control. It doesn't actually require that much operational coordination, but would result in net beneficial behavior at the ISP.
Yeah, I've got follow-up questions, but let's go to the audience. So this is a great question from Jan. Could the panelists comment on what they see as the potential for demand response outside of the residential space, particularly as it relates to large users? Do you consider residential loads intrinsically more flexible than large industrial or commercial loads? I would just say no, but
yeah, I can jump in there. I think I also would expect not. Our largest loads tend to have a lot of natural flexibility that, as much as is commercially sensible for each, considering their exposure to wholesale prices or whatever their contractual arrangements are. But one assumption that in every model, I'm sure that operates within this space is the scale of demand side participation or demand response. And we base our assumptions based on what we've observed, survey information that we send out to large loads and retailers and so forth. But also look at international benchmarks for how much demand side participation could we expect to be achieved. And it's actually been a point of reasonable interest in terms of how we've, in our consultation process for inputs and assumptions. But fundamentally, our assumptions incorporate, I guess, the learnings of other jurisdictions to expect a growth in demand response. There is a wholesale demand response mechanism that we have, and allowing for increased flexibility is part of what we anticipate to be that portfolio of solutions that Josh has been mentioning to, referencing successes we've seen domestically to date, but also in other jurisdictions. So there is an expectation that demand response can increase. It's not just from residential consumers, and there is a body of evidence from how other parts of the world are latching onto that or unlocking that as well, that we incorporate as well.
Great. So I'm going to take my whatever prerogative here to ask the last question. Thanks everybody for participating again, and Carol will share some links here. We'll share the links to the and the information. Actually, I'm going to pause for a second and make sure that Kirsty has a chance to add anything she might want to add. Kirsty, you're all good? Okay. So so one of the an anonymous attendee has asked, is the carrot and stick provided by near real-time markets enough to provide aggregated firmness? I think the premise that we're working under assumption, I'm working under assumption that the answer to that question is no. Right? So and that's this whole idea around the need to go acquire these resources. So Josh, I wanted to, you touched on this a little bit before, but I wanted to sort of talk a little bit, if you could talk a little bit about who actually goes out and acquires these, because this is in addition to sort of what's naturally happens and above and beyond policy interventions, right? So there's this Inflation Reduction Act in the US that many in Australia are already aware of that incentivizes customers to go put on more rooftop solar and batteries and all this stuff. People are still acquiring resources above and beyond that. Who are that? Are those retailers? Are they networks? So that would be like the distribution company themselves. Is it someone else? What type of organizations do that?
It varies. So, I mean, we have retail-facing folks who are acquiring these resources in some cases. So, like an ESCO, like an energy service company or something like that engages. And I would say the big trend in that area has been that moving down market. So historically, those companies were just focused on large industrial or like government buildings, like large accounts, because of like the wealth of incentives that are coming in, and just because of like software helping to automate some of these things. You've seen that move down market. So now we're getting like ESCO-like entities that are coming in to like the residential space. And I think that and then you have program implementers who work on behalf of either a network operator, not typically retailers. Retailers typically just have sort of very streamlined, they're very cost conscious and short term. So they're focused on customer retention and acquisition. So they don't operate on long time things, which gets to like the bigger issue. So like a lot of the problem here is a mismatch between the inherent discount rate and the risk tolerance of the customer versus the grid, right? So the grid is making really long-term decisions, and customers have, often, I mean, if you look at like retail choice, like retail customers make decisions with very high discounts that like implicitly, that is like they value now much more than they value the future. When you're looking at assets that are invested in customer homes, a new appliance or insulation or, a battery, those are 10, 20, 30-year investments. And when you tell them, oh, you're going to save money over 30 years, like, I don't care. that means almost nothing, but it means a lot to the grid. And so realigning that and saying like, okay, how can we correct for that market inefficiency with an incentive, or what ESCOs do, which is like structuring, like financing it in such a way that they see savings now. Those are the secrets to dealing with this. There's just so many market inefficiencies there that these programs can help unlock.
I think that's a great one to end on. I really want to thank you, Josh, Andrew, Kirsty, for your time today. The audience for all these wonderful questions. We will read, and if we can respond, or we have read them all, and we will respond as we can. Carol, do you want to take us home here?
Thank you. Yes, that was phenomenal. And I feel a little bit overwhelmed with so much knowledge and insights. Yeah, but thank you all again for your time and availability today. Thanks, Josh, for sharing your insights. Thanks, Andrew and Kirsty, for posing great questions and being part of the discussion. Thank you, Brian, for being the perfect facilitator, and special thanks to everyone who joined us today. Thanks for taking the time, the efforts. Thank you for posing the questions, and thank you for the continued interest in this project. So as you can see in the screen, can I kindly ask you to complete this very quick feedback survey on today's webinar? It will take you less than 3 minutes to complete, and it's just 5 questions and completely anonymous. So just use your mobile to scan the QR code. that you see, and tell us what you liked, what you wanted to hear more about. We use all of that to plan and deliver the next 2 webinars. And I just wanted to remind you as well of the 3rd webinar, which is going to happen next Friday, the 20th of October, same time, on integrating transmission and distribution planning. So we'll talk more about how best to plan across the transmission and the distribution interface and the role of consumer energy resources in all of this. So it will definitely pick up and expand on some of the discussion we had today. And by the end of today, you should receive an email from me with the slides that we shared, some more information on the next webinars, just in case you haven't registered. So this brings us to a close. Hope your Friday continues as efficient as it just started, and have a great weekend. Bye.